It's March 1945, and deep within Supreme Headquarters, a radio operator suddenly goes rigid. The communication line from Third Army abruptly ends in the middle of a transmission. There's no additional message, no verification, just the hiss of dead air. For the first time since the beaches of Normandy, Eisenhower finds himself completely in the dark about Patton's whereabouts and activities. The maps he's looking at are already obsolete, and the reports coming in are lagging behind by hours. The Western Front's most aggressive fighting force has simply vanished from communications. Eisenhower looks toward his staff members and poses a question nobody saw coming. Are we actually still directing Patton's movements, or has he pushed so far ahead that he's beyond our reach? It's now March 26, 1945, just 3 days since Patton quietly slipped across the Rhine at Oppenheim. Supreme Headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force finds itself processing situation reports that grow more confusing with each passing hour. Third Army isn't merely pushing forward, it's vanishing into German territory at a pace that defies tracking. Military units are reporting the capture of towns that won't even show up on operational maps for another full day. German soldiers being taken prisoner are claiming they were surrounded by American columns that seem to appear out of nowhere. In his war room, Eisenhower examines the maps with mounting anxiety. The blue arrows marking Third Army's positions are in constant flux, pushed forward, then adjusted again moments later. His staff officers are scrambling just to keep up with the flood of reports pouring in from numerous sources. 12th Corps has pushed across the main river. 20th Corps is closing in on Frankfurt. 8th Corps is racing toward the southeast, heading for Bavaria, but these reports aren't matching up with each other. Intelligence reports place one division in Aschaffenburg, while radio intercepts suggest that same division is actually 30 miles further east. This is a fundamental breakdown. Patton's forces are outpacing the very communication systems that were designed to monitor them. Radio operators in armored columns moving at maximum speed are finding it nearly impossible to stay in contact with headquarters in the rear. By the time messengers carrying written orders reach command posts, the commanders they're looking for have already relocated forward. Maps that were printed in the morning are completely out of date by the afternoon. As one staff officer puts it, Third Army has transformed into a phantom force. Everyone knows it exists and is making progress, but pinpointing its exact location at any specific moment has become impossible. General Omar Bradley, who commands the 12th Army Group, is attempting to maintain awareness of the situation, but he's finding himself depending more on Patton's personal phone calls than on formal military reports. Patton has a habit of calling from a freshly captured German headquarters, casually announcing he's taken yet another city, and then disconnecting before Bradley can probe for the tactical details that higher command desperately needs for coordination. These calls are classic Patton, short, victorious, and infuriatingly light on the tactical specifics that the upper chain of command requires to synchronize operations. Eisenhower's frustration intensifies as he comes to understand that this communication failure is generating serious operational hazards. Should Third Army push too far ahead of the other Allied forces, its flanks will be left vulnerable to German counterstrikes. If Patton's units become disconnected from their supply chains, they risk being isolated and annihilated. The Rhine crossing had been a stunning achievement, but that very success has spawned new complications that demand control. Control that Eisenhower is increasingly uncertain he actually possesses. On March 28th, Eisenhower calls together his senior staff for a meeting to address what one officer describes as the Patton problem. The issue isn't whether Third Army is succeeding on the battlefield. Clearly, it's tearing through German resistance along a wide front. The real question is whether Eisenhower can actually direct Third Army's movements, or whether Patton has essentially become a commander operating independently with his own campaign strategy. General Walter Bedell Smith, serving as Eisenhower's chief of staff, makes the case that Patton must be brought under control before his advance triggers strategic complications. Smith is concerned that Third Army is pushing into regions that the Allies had previously agreed would fall under Soviet occupation. If American troops capture territory designated for the Soviets, it will spark diplomatic tensions that could damage the alliance. Smith's recommendation is to order Patton to stop until the other Allied forces can close the gap. However, Eisenhower pauses to consider. He's familiar with Patton's operational mindset. Keep up unrelenting pressure, take advantage of every weakness in the German defense, and never allow the enemy a moment to regroup. This philosophy has delivered extraordinary results all the way from Normandy to the Rhine. Ordering Third Army to halt its momentum could provide German forces with the respite they need to construct fresh defensive positions. The price of reining in Patton might actually be higher than the advantage of keeping him under tight control. Eisenhower arrives at a decision that captures the complexity of his relationship with his most aggressive subordinate. He won't order Patton to stop. Instead, he'll attempt to guide Third Army's advance toward objectives that align with the wider Allied strategy, while acknowledging that detailed tactical oversight is simply not feasible given how fast operations are unfolding. This is management through objectives, rather than through direct orders, granting Patton the latitude to seize opportunities while nudging him toward strategic priorities. But before any of that can happen, Eisenhower needs to figure out where Patton actually is. March 29, 1945 arrives, and Frankfurt collapses to Third Army elements following fierce urban fighting. The city's capture holds strategic importance. Frankfurt serves as a crucial communications center and industrial hub. Yet Supreme Headquarters doesn't learn about the city's fall through military channels, but rather from a BBC radio broadcast. A war correspondent traveling with Third Army had transmitted his report hours before any official notification made its way to Eisenhower's staff. This communication collapse is turning into an embarrassment. Allied newspapers are publishing stories about Third Army's progress before Supreme Headquarters can even verify them. German radio stations monitoring American battlefield transmissions sometimes possess better intelligence about Third Army's locations than Eisenhower's own intelligence officers. This situation contradicts every fundamental principle of modern military command and control. Eisenhower directs his signals officers to set up direct communication with Patton's headquarters. Their efforts expose just how extensive the problem has become. Third Army headquarters has relocated forward 3 times in just 4 days, staying so close behind the advancing forces that signal units can't get reliable radio networks established before they're ordered to move again. Engineers are laying field telephone lines as quickly as they possibly can, but the armored columns are advancing faster than the wires can be strung behind them. Even courier aircraft are having difficulty locating Third Army command posts that relocate between flights. By March 30th, Eisenhower decides he needs to visit Third Army in person. If remote communication with Patton is impossible, he'll travel to the front and locate him directly. The journey is made more complex by security issues. German Special Operations Forces are still active behind Allied lines, and traveling to a forward headquarters whose position keeps shifting presents obvious dangers. Nevertheless, Eisenhower's staff makes the arrangements, and on March 31st, the Supreme Commander's motorcade departs for what intelligence believes to be Third Army's current position. They discover Third Army headquarters in a German town with a name nobody in the group can pronounce properly, set up in a building that had been hastily occupied after serving as Wehrmacht headquarters just days before. Patton's staff is in perpetual motion, officers taking in reports, issuing commands, updating maps, all with a frantic energy that stands in sharp contrast to the measured pace back at Supreme Headquarters. This is an organization built for velocity, and every aspect of how it operates reflects that single priority. Patton welcomes Eisenhower with his typical self-assurance. He delivers a rapid-fire briefing covering Third Army's current positions, objectives, and the operations scheduled for the coming days. The briefing is nothing short of masterful. Patton knows precisely where every division is positioned, what each one is currently engaged in, and what he plans for them to accomplish next. He demonstrates absolute command over his army, despite the communication challenges that are plaguing higher headquarters. Eisenhower listens carefully, then poses the question that brought him all the way to the front lines. "George, do you have any idea where you are on the map I've been studying back in Frankfurt?" Patton glances briefly at the map Eisenhower has brought along. "Not exactly, Ike, but I know exactly where I'm headed." The response is quintessential Patton, brushing aside administrative concerns, laser-focused purely on operational goals. But it's also revealing. Patton isn't experiencing communication problems because his systems have broken down. He's experiencing communication problems because he views frequent status updates to higher headquarters as an unwelcome distraction from the business of winning battles. Eisenhower makes it clear that while he values Third Army's achievements, Patton must maintain better communication with both 12th Army Group and Supreme Headquarters. Bradley needs this information to coordinate operations between 3rd Army and the other forces. Eisenhower needs it to ensure that Patton's advances stay aligned with strategic objectives and Allied agreements. The current arrangement, where 3rd Army functions semi-independently, simply cannot continue. Patton agrees to improve communications, but as Eisenhower departs the meeting, he's uncertain whether Patton genuinely grasps the severity of the problem or is merely saying what his commander wants to hear. The drive back to Frankfurt provides Eisenhower with time to think about his most complicated subordinate. Patton achieves victories on the battlefield that no other American general could pull off, but he accomplishes this partly by disregarding constraints that Eisenhower is forced to consider: diplomatic relationships, alliance politics, and resource distribution across multiple armies. Keeping Patton in check requires constant vigilance and periodic intervention to ensure that tactical brilliance doesn't generate strategic complications. As April 1945 arrives and 3rd Army drives even deeper into Germany, Eisenhower confronts a question that extends beyond immediate operational concerns. Has American military doctrine produced commanders that it cannot effectively control? The problem isn't limited to Patton alone. General Douglas MacArthur in the Pacific is operating with almost complete independence. General Mark Clark in Italy is pursuing his own objectives without always coordinating with Allied forces. But Patton represents the perfect example of the tension between granting field commanders the freedom to capitalize on opportunities and maintaining strategic unity across theater-level operations. This issue has roots in history. During the Civil War, Union generals such as William Tecumseh Sherman and Philip Sheridan had led independent campaigns that were loosely coordinated with the overall strategy, but carried out with minimal interference from Washington. Their achievements demonstrated that aggressive commanders, when given freedom to operate, could deliver results that centralized control simply couldn't achieve. Yet the Civil War had also witnessed catastrophes when independent commanders lost track of strategic objectives or pushed beyond their supply lines into disaster. Eisenhower has studied military history extensively and understands these historical examples. He also recognizes that the increased complexity of modern warfare makes command and control simultaneously more critical and more challenging. Coordinating operations that involve millions of soldiers, thousands of aircraft, and intricate logistics demands the kind of centralized planning that Patton's operational approach actively resists. However, Eisenhower also acknowledges that overly rigid control can backfire. The German army's experience on the Eastern Front illustrates what happens when political leadership micromanages military operations. Hitler's stubborn refusal to authorize retreats had annihilated entire armies that might have been preserved through flexible responses. German field commanders who could have mounted effective defensive operations found themselves paralyzed by directives from Berlin that had no connection to the actual battlefield situation. The challenge lies in discovering the right balance, giving commanders like Patton sufficient freedom to leverage their abilities while retaining enough control to prevent strategic catastrophes. Eisenhower's approach, which he refers to as directive command, involves specifying strategic objectives and distributing resources, then allowing subordinate commanders flexibility in how they accomplish their assigned missions. This method works effectively with disciplined officers who comprehend the strategic context. With Patton, however, it's considerably more complicated. Patton understands strategy quite well. He reads history extensively, studies past campaigns, and comprehends how his operations fit into the broader Allied objectives. But he also holds the conviction that strategic success emerges from aggressive tactical action that creates advantageous situations, rather than from centralized planning that attempts to control every detail. When Patton identifies an opportunity, his natural impulse is to exploit it instantly rather than request permission and risk the moment passing. This pattern creates recurring situations where Patton's actions surpass his authority or complicate Eisenhower's plans. The Rhine crossing at Oppenheim perfectly illustrates this pattern. Patton had received authorization to prepare for a crossing, but hadn't been explicitly ordered to carry one out. He crossed anyway, presenting Eisenhower with a fait accompli that turned out to be strategically advantageous, but demonstrated Patton's willingness to interpret orders in the most liberal way possible. "General Marshall, The Army Chief of Staff back in Washington is monitoring these developments with considerable interest. Marshall has defended Patton multiple times throughout the war, maintaining that his effectiveness on the battlefield outweighs his character defects. But Marshall is also worried that American military culture is producing prima donna generals who feel entitled to operate independently. After the war concludes, the Army will need to reconstruct command structures that were disrupted by rapid wartime expansion. Officers who have commanded divisions and corps will return to peacetime assignments requiring different skill sets. How will men who've grown accustomed to independent command adjust to peacetime hierarchy? Eisenhower shares these concerns, but he's facing more pressing problems right now. Third Army is approaching areas where strategic decisions about post-war Europe must be taken into account. Soviet forces are advancing from the east. The Allies have reached agreements on occupation zones. If Third Army captures territory that's been designated for Soviet occupation, should Eisenhower order a withdrawal? What if Patton refuses to comply? This question isn't merely theoretical. Intelligence suggests Third Army might reach Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia, before Soviet forces arrive. Capturing Prague would carry symbolic significance and could influence post-war European politics. But the Allies had agreed that Czechoslovakia would fall within the Soviet sphere of influence. Eisenhower needs to ensure that Patton doesn't trigger a diplomatic crisis by liberating Prague and then refusing to withdraw. On April 15th, Eisenhower transmits explicit orders. Third Army will halt at the Mulde River line and will not advance toward Prague without specific authorization. The orders are crystal clear, leaving absolutely no room for Patton's typical creative interpretation. Eisenhower also makes it explicitly clear that these orders originate from the highest levels of Allied command and reflect political decisions that field commanders don't possess the authority to alter. Patton complies with the orders, but his diary entries from this period reveal frustration that reflects his broader attitude toward strategic constraints he considers misguided. By late April 1945, Germany is in complete collapse. Wehrmacht units are surrendering en masse, or simply disintegrating as soldiers desert to return home. Third Army is capturing thousands of prisoners every single day, processing them through collection points that become overwhelmed by the sheer volume. But the war isn't completely finished yet, and pockets of resistance persist where fanatical Nazi loyalists or trapped German forces continue fighting. Eisenhower's orders to halt at the Mulde River have created a situation where Third Army sits in the positions it has captured, while Soviet forces advance to link up from the east. For Patton, who's accustomed to constant forward momentum, this forced halt is pure agony. His diary entries from this period express contempt for political decisions that are preventing him from exploiting Third Army's momentum. He's convinced that American forces could have reached Berlin, Prague, and Vienna before the Soviets if political considerations hadn't restrained military operations. But Eisenhower understands complexities that Patton either doesn't perceive or deliberately chooses to ignore. The war in Europe is winding down, but the war against Japan is still ongoing. Preserving the Soviet alliance matters for Pacific operations. Soviet entry into the war against Japan will save American lives by forcing Japanese forces to fight on two fronts. Antagonizing Stalin over occupation zones in Europe could jeopardize that crucial cooperation. Furthermore, capturing territory that the Allies would then be forced to evacuate creates problems without any offsetting benefits. If Third Army takes Prague and then withdraws when Soviet forces arrive, it will look like an American military defeat. If Third Army refuses to withdraw, it will create a direct confrontation with the Soviet Union that could escalate in unpredictable ways. Either outcome is worse than simply allowing Soviet forces to capture cities that have been designated for their occupation. On May 4th, Germany's remaining military leadership initiates surrender negotiations. By May 7th, the unconditional surrender is signed. The European war has ended. Third Army's final positions reflect both its spectacular advance and the strategic constraints that Eisenhower imposed. Patton has led his army from Normandy all the way to Czechoslovakia, liberated more territory than any other American force, and captured over 500,000 German prisoners. But he hasn't reached Berlin or Prague, objectives he believed Third Army could have achieved. The victory parades and celebrations that follow Germany's surrender provide Eisenhower and Patton their final significant interaction during wartime. In public, both men express mutual respect and celebrate Third Army's accomplishments. In private, their relationship remains as complicated as ever. Eisenhower admires Patton's battlefield brilliance, but remains cautious about his political judgment. Patton respects Eisenhower's strategic position, but resents what he perceives as excessive caution that prevented even greater victories. Years down the road, historians would argue about whether Eisenhower had been correct to constrain Patton's operations during the war's final weeks. Some would argue that capturing Prague and pushing farther east would have positioned the West more favorably for post-war negotiations with the Soviets. Others would maintain that Eisenhower's decisions reflected a realistic assessment of military and political realities that aggressive action couldn't have changed. What remained clear was that Eisenhower's management of Patton throughout the entire war represented one of his most significant command achievements. He had shielded Patton after the slapping incidents when many were demanding his removal. He had given Patton command of Third Army despite ongoing concerns about his judgment. He had granted Patton sufficient operational freedom to achieve spectacular results while maintaining just enough control to prevent strategic disasters. The balance had been delicate and required constant adjustment, but it had functioned. The question Eisenhower had posed back in March, "Do we still control Patton?" had been answered in the affirmative, but only just barely, and only because Eisenhower understood when to give Patton free rein and when to pull him back. Managing genius demanded recognizing that conventional command structures couldn't always contain or direct extraordinary talent. The art lay in finding methods to channel that talent toward productive ends, while preventing it from creating problems that outweighed its value. September 1945 arrives, 4 months after Germany's surrender. Eisenhower sits in his office contemplating yet another impossible decision concerning Patton. His most brilliant subordinate has transformed into his most difficult problem now that the shooting has stopped. Patton's resistance to denazification policies in Bavaria has generated political backlash. His comparison of Nazis to American political parties during a press conference has sparked outrage. Eisenhower has shielded Patton multiple times during the war. How many more times can he continue to do so? On September 28th, Eisenhower relieves Patton of command of Third Army. The conversation between these two generals is tense. According to Patton's diary, Eisenhower was more excited than I have ever seen him. The relief is phrased in administrative language. Patton is being reassigned to 15th Army to compile historical reports. But both men understand it represents an effective demotion, removing Patton from the operational command he lives for. Eisenhower struggles with this decision. Patton has saved his command numerous times during the war. When the Normandy breakout had stalled, Patton's breakthrough had rescued the campaign. When German forces attacked in the Ardennes, Patton's relief of Bastogne had prevented a potential catastrophe. Without Patton, the European war might have dragged on for months longer and cost thousands more American lives. Eisenhower owes him a debt. But the war has ended, and different skills matter now. Occupation demands diplomatic sensitivity, political awareness, and a willingness to implement policies that might seem counterintuitive to combat commanders. Patton lacks these qualities and shows no interest in developing them. His value as a battlefield commander is no longer relevant, and his liabilities as a military governor are creating problems that Eisenhower can no longer overlook. In the weeks following his relief, Patton adjusts to his new assignment. He drives his staff at 15th Army to complete historical reports with the same intensity he had brought to combat operations. He spends time hunting and visiting with his family, but letters to friends reveal his bitterness about how his career has concluded. The general who had led armies across Europe is now compiling paperwork in a backwater headquarters. On December 9, 1945, Patton is heading out for a hunting trip when his car collides with an army truck near Mannheim. He suffers a broken neck and severe spinal injuries that leave him paralyzed from the neck down. Eisenhower visits him in the hospital and finds his old friend remarkably composed, despite his devastating condition. They discuss the war, the campaigns they fought together, and the soldiers they commanded. 12 days later, on December 21st, Patton dies from a blood clot that travels to his heart. Eisenhower receives the phone call and feels the loss profoundly. Whatever complications Patton had created, whatever frustrations he had caused, the man had been extraordinary. American victory in Europe owed more to Patton's battlefield genius than to any other single factor. What Eisenhower says when Patton's silence becomes permanent is recorded in a straightforward statement issued to the press. General Patton was one of the most brilliant soldiers America has produced. His daring and aggressive fighting qualities brought about phenomenal successes on the battlefield. He will be missed by his country, and especially by those of us who knew him. The words are formal, appropriate for an official announcement. But those who knew Eisenhower understood they carried significance beyond mere protocol. The question Eisenhower had asked during the war, whether he could control Patton, had ultimately been answered not by command decisions, but by death. The silence that had frustrated Eisenhower during Third Army's lightning advances has become permanent silence. The radio won't crackle anymore with Patton's voice announcing another captured city. The telephone won't ring with Patton demanding more fuel or complaining about constraints. The maps won't show Third Army advancing faster than anyone can monitor. Patton is gone. The war he helped win has ended, and Eisenhower is left to reflect on what it cost to command a genius and what it meant to lose one.